Filming this on a Sunday morning. This is not going to be the typical DoorDash, Uber Eats driver content. This is something totally off the beaten path on that one. But what if I told you that churches should be taxed? Yeah, correct. This one's going to burn some britches, and ruffle a lot of feathers. But I do believe that churches do need to be subject to an income tax. And here's why. You see, tax exemptions on churches originated in a time in this country, I believe sometime in the 1800s, when they contributed a large amount to social well-being in organizations that provided social services in this country. In many churches, though, that is no longer the case. And I have a way to address that part coming up in a hot minute. But in the meantime, churches should be taxed. You know, like the old scripture goes, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. It's time for them, I believe, to pay up in this regard. And I say this as a very faithful and very devoted Christian in my own right. I do believe that Jesus is the Son of God. He did ascend from heaven, and he did die for our sins. It doesn't change my view of churches, though, and the organizations as a whole, and they need to be taxed. Do I think Jesus would have been good with churches being taxed? To some extent, yes, because I believe the Roman Empire took plenty out of the first century church, which was not formed as a corporation, but was formed as basically a house church, what would be considered a house church today. And those individuals were taxed quite heavily. I'm sure the Apostle Paul paid more than his share of it, or at least his share of it, which was pretty steep at this particular time. And of course, as you know, Jesus didn't operate in a time when tax collectors were not viewed very favorably. Zacchaeus, of course, being a notable tax collector who repented, and you got to understand that tax collectors in the Roman Empire, they collected more than the actual tax. They were basically running a grift. Not much different from the current megachurch situation. Now, am I looking to snare the present-day house church that meets in a small house? No. Now, let me describe my solution here, okay? Churches would be charged an income tax just like we are as individuals. However, there would be a certain exemption level, just like we are as individuals. There is a certain personal exemption level. I believe it's like $3,800 this year for us individuals. So say for churches, let's say it's like an income of $500,000. Let's say that's the personal exemption. You pull in less than $500,000 of revenue, you're not going to be charged a tax as a church. The standard exemption would apply much the same to a church as it does for us as individuals. Now, the other part is, most mega churches do not contribute very much at all to the social welfare and well-being of their community. However, I have a reward for the ones that do. So say you're a church that does collect and contribute a substantial amount to individuals or organizations that provide food banks, shelters, women's shelters, things like that. You do those types of things. You take some of your money, you contribute to that. That's a tax write-off for you as a church. You would be able to write off all of that against your tax bill. Well, you contribute for what things that were traditionally addressed by churches. But let's say you address them in the present day, whereas most churches don't. But you do. Guess what? You get a write-off. Because that's the initial intention of churches being able to write off income taxes. And I will cheerfully allow for that in any potential I have. Now, in this current administration, do I think that this would happen? No. Because the Trump administration, I believe, panders to churches while not necessarily being Christians in their own right, especially the president himself. The vice president, I do believe, is. So Vance is definitely a Catholic. But Trump, I mean, there's no even PR photos of him going to church. The only PR video of him is of holding up a Bible in front of a church near the White House. Now, so under that backdrop, do I think that this would ever happen in the present day administration? No. Because this administration and this version of the Republican Party cater towards mega church and evangelical votes, such as my own. But of course, I'm not your typical evangelical either. I go against the grain on many things. As I mentioned on social media earlier, I have attempted to. I don't believe that Christians should be yoked in marriage with unbelievers. Now, if you're an unbeliever, the Bible and its rules, we like people to become Christians and to be saved in the faith, but at the same time, if you're not a believer, it's not our job to make you live by them biblically. It's not our job to force you to do that. The government's not a theocracy. And so yes, when I'm thinking about churches that need to be taxed, the folks I'm thinking of are like Lakewood Church in Houston, which is Joel Osteen's church. And I think he preaches a false gospel, the prosperity gospel, which says that if you give money to the church, God will just pour buckets of money on you. Clearly false. Clearly a false teaching. Or Kenneth Copeland. You know about him. He of the mega jets purchased by his church. Those jets of Kenneth Copeland's are certainly not getting a write-off in my tax scheme. And there are many other churches who I think should be taxed. Now, when I'm thinking about the Catholic Church, I think they do have a high amount of income, but they also do have a high amount of outgo into social community programs. So I think with them, I think it's a balance. I think it would be a mixed bag for them. The Catholic Church in America would be taxed, but not as heavily as some of the mega churches on the evangelical side. Of course, Joel Osteen. Lakewood Church used to be the Summit, which was the Houston Rockets basketball arena. He bought this, and his church bought this arena. They own this property. This is also property that appreciates, I believe, in the real estate game. Amanda, I'm going to have you tagged on this one. I think you're going to agree with this assessment. I think they should also get hit with a capital gains tax while we're at it for the appreciation of their Lakewood Church property, which was formerly the Summit, which was the Rockets basketball arena in Houston. A building that he refused to open up for the good of the community during Hurricane Harvey. I have a saying that his tax exemption should have been stripped from him and given to Mattress Mac, real name Jim Mackingvale. He was the founder and still is the owner of the Gallery Furniture outlet chain in Houston. He took his furniture showrooms and he housed people during Hurricane Harvey who were homeless and were driven from their homes by the rising floodwaters. One of these is near my hometown of Katy, which is the South Katy Richmond showroom of his. He sent his truck drivers into the streets of Katy, West Houston, rounded up people who were clearly stranded on the sides of the roads, outside of their flooded homes, rounded them up, and had them housed in his showrooms on brand new furniture and bedding. This guy deserves the tax exemption. I still remember the tagline from when I was a kid from his ads. Gallery furniture really will save you money. The man is a master marketer, by the way. Speaking of which, he took this he said, you know what? What am I going to do with all this old furniture? Well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to have a Hurricane Harvey sale. I'm going to have a markdown on all of this furniture that allowed all of these unfortunate souls to have a good night's sleep on. I'm just going to sell them. And I'm going to market it heavily at a discount, which he's very, very gifted and talented at, by the way. So Jim McIngvale should get the discount that Joel should get the tax write-off that Joel Osteen unfairly, I believe, presently has. So there it is, guys. I'm ruffling everybody's feathers this morning. Churches should be taxed. I know as a man who has gone to a mega church now for the past several years, and of course I suggested to them a group about believers not being yoked with unbelievers, which is a scriptural belief that and a conviction of mine personally. Again, it's gonna ruffle the feathers of a lot of unbelievers as well, just like I'm ruffling the feathers of all the believers right now. But they rejected my offer of leading a group out of hand, because they say that they don't believe in addressing those types of issues in groups. Well, I think they showed their hand. I think Eagle Brook showed their hand. Their concern right now is preaching the gospel, but not to a level where it's going to offend anybody or cause them to withdraw their tithes and money. And of course, they're also obsessed with numbers. Even the small groups that they have right now, they track them for numbers in attendance. Numbers in attendance at church services and in their buildings are what matters, and their monetary income is what matters to them most. Not keeping people saved in salvation and in fellowship with Jesus Christ. So yes, tax them. Tax them all. Or tax as many as you can under my terms. Again, there would be an exemption level. Let's say income of a church is less than $500,000. There's no income tax for that church. Because I don't want to snag the small church that is operating in an office out of the pastor's house, but still does good for its community. I do not want to snag these churches at all. I also don't want to snag churches that invest very heavily in social programs for their communities. So say a church were to give heavily to say, very heavily to say, my favorite social organization in the Twin Cities is called Second Harvest Heartland. What they do is they basically take excess food, package it, and provide it for hungry people in the Twin Cities metropolitan area. You give to something heavily to give a very good chunk of your revenue as a church to an organization like this, write it off. I don't want that to be taxed. So with that, all this said, this has been a long one. Tax them. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. I really believe in this, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime in the next few years. Because the present administration and the present party in charge depends on conservative evangelical voters. And so with that said, I'm going to call this one a wrap after an almost 15-minute episode here. If you stuck to the end of this, appreciate you. And if you agree or disagree, drop a note in the comments below. I'll be back with probably more driver content later on, but for the time being, this is my personal content. I've said recently that this channel was going to be a mix. I will talk to you later. Peace out, homies.